In the 7th year of being with Arthur, he accompanied another woman to choose a wedding dress. Everyone was waiting to see my joke. Over the years, others have said that I was so skillful that I managed to keep this master by my side for so many years. There were also people who privately warned me that being too greedy would break the rules. This time, I didn't make a fuss. I just smiled and said congratulations. On the day I left Beijing, Arthur's friend reminded him, "The little bird you've been keeping is about to fly away." He didn't say yes or no, with a lazy smile, after experiencing the hardships outside, she'll come back obediently. Until I accepted a media interview and the ring on my ring finger sparkled. That very night, Arthur traveled across mountains and rivers all the way to Hong Kong. I was at an investor's wine party when I saw the photo of Arthur shopping for wedding dresses with another woman. At that time, among the toasts and conversations at the full table, I was seizing every opportunity to introduce the profit points and return period of the new project to them. The female companion brought by one of the investors exclaimed, attracting the attention of everyone at the table. I turned to look at her and couldn't quite remember whether I had met her before for a moment. She tapped on her phone and said a bit embarrassedly, "Oh, I just saw a photo. It's Mr. Arthur. My little sister sent me a photo. He seems to be accompanying the daughter of the Tang family to look at wedding dresses. So it seems that something good is coming soon. Miss Lily, have you broken up with Mr. Arthur?" She suddenly blinked her eyes and asked me curiously. In an instant, the eyes of everyone in the private room, those that were inquisitive, doubtful, or waiting to see a joke, all focused on me. She then covered her mouth again, "If it weren't for Mr. Arthur's sake." "Nonsense." The man beside her interrupted her. "Miss Lily, this little girl is being naughty and talking nonsense. Come on, let me toast you with this glass of wine." I raised my glass and smiled gracefully. Everyone has witnessed the achievements of Yunchuang technology in the field of intelligent data in recent years. If the current project had no value, so many of us wouldn't waste our time on it. Recently, Yunchuang was bidding for the intelligent A middle platform project of Bank of China and it had reached a critical moment. After thinking for a while, I added, "Of course, if you're doing this because of Arthur, I'm still sincerely grateful to all of you for giving Yunchuang this opportunity to stand in front of you." The tinkling sound of the wine glasses clinking rang in my mind one after another. I tried my best to force myself not to think about that so-called wedding dress shop. Maybe she had made a mistake. After all, just before I left home, he hooked my scarf with 2 fingers. With a lazy look in his eyes, he still didn't forget to tell me to come back early. When I looked up from the wash basin in the bathroom, a person suddenly appeared in the mirror. At this time, I remembered that I should have met her. It was 7 years ago when I had just started being with Arthur. It seemed that embarrassing me at the dinner table wasn't enough. She touched up her lipstick in front of the mirror and said with a coquettish smile, "I've always said that these rich young men are just playing around. In the end, they still have to follow their family's arrangements to get married. Some people are just daydreaming." "Oh, you have a high education, right? Our Miss Lily graduated from Peking University. Aren't you still relying on men like me? The only difference is that your man is more powerful." I said calmly, "Miss May, come and tell me these things when you sit in Mr. Wang's position. Mr. Wang is her current patron." I only found out later that before Arthur was with me, the person by his side was this Miss May. At that time, she had only been with him for 3 days. She managed to find out about me and had always thought that I had snatched her business from her, so she held a grudge until today. After all, being able to follow Arthur was an opportunity that one couldn't ask for. Even a tiny bit of favor from people like them would bring ordinary people wealth that could last for several lifetimes. Back then, she managed to hook up with another friend in Arthur's circle just to meet me. After meeting me, she deliberately provoked and instigated. I was only 20 years old at that time and was in the most passionate and pure period with Arthur, so I lost my temper with him because of this. He coaxed me, pampered me, and smiled while admitting his mistakes. Later, I never saw Miss May again. Unexpectedly, after so many years, she was still brooding over what had happened back then. She stamped her feet. Her wine-red Dior kitten heel shoes made a thumping sound on the floor. When she turned to leave, she looked back and said, "By the way, Miss Lily, you don't have that photo, right? I'll send it to you on WeChat. If you haven't blocked me, you're welcome." I twitched the corners of my mouth. There was no way I would add her on WeChat. However, after a while, a picture message popped up on WeChat. After a long while, I finally clicked on my phone. There was no need to identify it carefully. For someone I had been so close to day and night, someone so familiar, I could recognize him at a glance. I skillfully pressed the save button and then blocked her. In fact, I had saved another photo of Arthur with a female companion before. In these 7 years that seemed both short and long, it seemed that each photo foreshadowed the end of my relationship with him. It was hard to talk about and difficult to end gracefully. However, even though no one had ever been optimistic about it, it was still my genuine youthful love after all. That intense love that had been so vivid might have already reached the time to fade away. After the wine party was over, when my assistant handed me my coat, he asked worriedly, "Boss, will those investors change their attitudes according to the situation?" I tightened my collar and turned to ask, "How many years have you been in the company?" "4 years. Yunchuang was founded 5 years ago. I recruited you in the second year. You know best how it has come this far." Suddenly, a sense of helplessness hit me. I lost the desire to continue talking and just waved my hand to let him go. Even someone who had been by my side for so long thought like this. No wonder outsiders were watching the fun. Since I dared to take this path, I also dared to back out. But I needed him to give me a proper explanation. Amid the glitz and glamour, I stood outside the private room that Justin had told me about. When I put my hand on the doorknob, I heard Justin raise his voice and ask, "Brother, don't you plan to give Lily an explanation?" The music became quieter and Arthur asked him, "Why? It seems that you're more anxious than I am." "I just can't stand the way you are." Justin had been afraid of him since childhood, but at this moment, he had some courage. Before Arthur could reply, another person took over the conversation. "Hey, Xiaobai, it's just for fun. Why are you so serious? Don't mention brother Arthur. Even in my family, if I told my mom that I wanted to marry Lily, she would break my legs." I recognized him. I had met him a few times. What he said about belittling his own family were just modest remarks. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to mix in Arthur's circle. He shouted, "In my opinion, we've seen all kinds of women. There's no need. Just take what happened 2 years ago." Zhou Huayan also made a big fuss with his family because of an actress. In the end, that woman still married someone in Hong Kong. People didn't dare to talk about it in public, but they were secretly laughing at it. "Brother Arthur, don't be silly. It's not worth it." "Shut up." Justin interrupted him. "Do you always have so much to say?" After a while, Arthur said, "Xiaobai, my affairs with her are none of your business." Justin snorted coldly, "You're taking advantage of her liking you to bully her. She has her own will. She'll leave sooner or later." Arthur seemed to smile slowly and then, as if trying to convince someone, said in a tough tone, "As long as I don't say stop, this relationship between me and her won't end." I leaned against the side wall. The strap of my handbag was clenched tightly by me until it was deformed. In the end, I didn't push open that door. At 12 o'clock at midnight, looking out from the lounge on the 80th floor of the World Trade Center, there were tall buildings everywhere and the lights never went out. From above, the streets became a river shining with stars, winding and flowing towards the darkness. My phone rang at this time. I let it ring for a long time without answering it. It rang a second time, stopped, and then I picked it up when it rang for the third time. Arthur's voice came with a light smile. "Where are you? Do you need me to pick you up?" I looked at myself reflected in the window glass, with long chestnut curly hair and bright red lips. Even if I didn't want to admit it, 7 years had passed and none of us was young anymore. When I picked up the phone, I just asked him, "Arthur, where did you go today?" "What, checking up on me?" "I had dinner with a friend." There was the sound of a car starting, and his tone was clearly teasing. "Our Lily is a busy person now. There's a wine party today and golf tomorrow. How can you have time for me, an idle person?" Usually at this time, I would smile and coax him. Actually, he rarely showed childishness. Only when he was with me did he like to tease and play around. Children carefully raised in wealthy and powerful families had a smooth life for decades. If they took a fancy to something today, someone would eagerly offer it to them tomorrow. For them, there was nothing that couldn't be given up, and there was nothing that they had to strive for. They were indifferent to worldly affairs and couldn't show the kind of love that the common people thought of. I just leaned against the windowsill like this, just like when I was 20 years old, leaning against the big pillar of the dormitory building and asking him charmingly, "Just give it a try. What are you afraid of?" "And now?" I just said softly, "I seem to be a bit drunk." My tone carried a touch of desolation as I slowly asked, "Arthur, have you ever thought about proposing to me?" I didn't even have the courage to ask the embarrassing question of, "Have you ever thought about marrying me?" I just wanted to know whether he had ever had a momentary thought for me during those not-so-serious years. There was silence on the other end for a while before I heard a bit of laughter. His tone was as laid back as always. "It seems that you're really drunk. Be good and wait for me to pick you up." Arthur was such a smart person. How could he not tell whether I was really drunk or just pretending? It was just that he couldn't give an answer and yet didn't want to let go. Suddenly, I laughed. Tears uncontrollably slid down my face in the mirror. I said in a normal tone, "It's so late. There's no need to pick me up." Only today did I realize. It's not that I woke up too late. It's just that I was blinded by love for so many years and didn't want to wake up. Those 7 years that were as glorious as fireworks in full bloom were ultimately just a display of fireworks that didn't care about life or death in the doomsday. They were brilliant but doomed to disappear. It was the second year after I arrived in Beijing. With the greatest aspiration in my life, I rushed towards this profound northern land from the distant and warm south. At that time, for an art exhibition of the chief professor at the Central Academy of Fine Arts, just one ticket cost me nearly half a month's living expenses. When I first met him, he was dressed in a black suit, looking neat and formal. However, the unbuttoned collar of his shirt revealed his casual nature inside. I had observed all the paintings of that professor by myself. So when he led a group of elders in suits and with graying hair and gave a random introduction, I couldn't help but whisper, "This painting uses the faint light of the setting sun as a metaphor for a dying state, not the rising sun." With one hand in his pocket, he turned his head to look at me and smiled harmlessly. "Oh, I've met an expert." The man in front of me had a face as cold and white as snow. His nose was straight and sharp. When he looked over, his eyes were slightly lowered, not allowing others to peek into any secrets. Even when he was smiling enthusiastically, he still seemed distant and indifferent. I held my school bag and stood there charmingly, with my face a bit flushed. Back then, as a young and sentimental person, that moment was truly unforgettable. With just one glance, just one look, I remembered his angular jaw and the charm and elegance hidden from the corners of his eyes downward. Later, when I was with him, I found out that the chief professor of the Central Academy of Fine Arts, whose name I had long known, was his aunt. And the analysis of the paintings that he talked nonsense about that day was what his aunt had told him while pointing at the paintings. Only I had guessed the meaning based on those unfounded rumors. In the same year, someone was so bold as to race cars in the narrow campus area and crashed into the doors of several experimental buildings one after another. At that time, when some children from wealthy families got into trouble outside, they would shout out who their fathers were, and their tempers were even bigger than that of the emperor. Only the one who crashed the car was grabbed by the neck and forced to apologize to the administrative staff. That was the second time I met Arthur. He was pressing the young man's head with his hand and coldly ordered him to apologize and make amends. The young man was Justin. When he saw me, he rushed over quickly and stammered while gesturing, "Lily, don't misunderstand. I'm not that irresponsible person. I just had a momentary brain fart. I won't do it again next time." I peeked at the man in the distance over his shoulder, feeling puzzled. "You don't need to explain it to me. I don't seem to be familiar with you." Justin scratched his head and, for some reason, let out a deep sigh. His extremely handsome baby face looked a bit childish. I heard that he skipped grades in school and was in the same grade as me but was 1 year younger than me. But once when Arthur was annoyed by him, he revealed his secret, saying that his educational background was obtained because his father donated 2 buildings. It was also at that time that I found out that their family believed in being transferred from other places. During those 4 years, almost no one knew where Justin came from. Only I knew that he was Arthur's cousin and was one of the few people who could draw Arthur's attention. But that was all I knew. I had never thought deeply or probed further. I originally thought that those encounters were just accidental bright spots in the ever-changing life and had never thought that there would be a possibility of meeting again. But fate is always beyond people's control. At that time, I could never have imagined that I would experience all the greed and resentment in my life with such a person who was even casual about love. Others always thought that since we were admitted to such good schools, we must have studied hard every day, like hanging our heads from the beam and stabbing our thighs with an awl. But it wasn't entirely the case. My roommate Jenny was good at both having fun and studying. She even went too far and ended up in the police station. She got into a fight with others in a bar and her opponent happened to be Justin. After waking up from being drunk, she grabbed my arm and trembled, shrinking like an ostrich. "Lily, I'm going to die. I don't want to go to jail." Justin had a swollen eye and hissed with pain while feeling aggrieved. "You were the one who started the fight first. Why did you have to pass by there? Are you still being reasonable?" As their voices went back and forth, when I looked up at the sky helplessly, Arthur walked in wearing a black overcoat, carrying the chill of snow. Later, in the chaos, he seemed to look up for a moment and then arranged for people to cooperate and handle the matter. After Jenny was taken home, I wrapped my clothes tightly and when I walked out of the police station, the first snow of the year that I hadn't seen for a long time greeted me. In my impression, the first snow of that year had been waited for a long time but didn't come until February 9th after the spring festival of 2011 had passed. People from the south have a persistent preference for snow. On that cold winter night, I stretched out my hands tirelessly to catch the snowflakes. I raised my head and played for quite a while. A black Maybach slowly stopped beside me. I in the surrounding darkness, only his eyes were clear and bright as he smiled and said, "The snow is heavy. Let me give you a ride." I held onto my thick scarf with both hands and stared at him fixedly. At that time, I didn't understand that I was free in the snow. Where he was standing, behind him was pitch black, and even his figure was hidden in the darkness as if he was out of reach. But I just jumped for joy, being brave, and walked towards him recklessly and regardless of the consequences. The snowflakes fell behind me, cold, wanton, and sweeping everything away. The snowflakes seemed to have fallen on my face too. The icy fingertips lingered, waking me up from my dream. I opened my eyes. The hotel room was pitch black. The person beside me still had the chill on him that hadn't dissipated completely and invaded me as if trying to drag me down with him. Didn't I say you didn't need to come? I slowly sat up and leaned against the headboard, looking for his outline in the darkness. His voice sounded a bit tired as he played with my hand casually. Don't you miss me after not seeing me for a day? I remained silent, and he was too lazy to turn on the light. In this kind of standoff, he suddenly laughed. Sean said you're preparing for the Hong Kong branch company. Such a big thing, why didn't I hear you mention it to me? I curved my lips. In my heart, I thought, Justin also told me that you're getting engaged. Such a big thing, why didn't I hear you mention it to me either? I blinked my somewhat sore eyes. At this time, I still felt reluctant to part with those bumpy years that couldn't be held on to. When I was almost on the verge of crying, I asked hoarsely, Arthur, can't I be your legitimate lover? It was like tearing off the last layer of gauze, laying the already bloody facts clearly in front of us. His hand paused for a moment. It seemed that he didn't expect me to be so straightforward and caught him off guard. Why not? Perhaps sensing that this relationship was already on the verge of collapse, he no longer avoided answering. Lily, haven't I treated you well? Over the years, there has been no one else by my side except you. Such kindness was insignificant to others, but for people like them, it was already the extreme. However, I actually heard a bit of reluctance to let me go from his defense. When had he ever lowered his head or tried to keep anyone before, but what did he want to keep me for? I pushed him away word by word. If you want me to stay, then what? How are you going to arrange for me? With a click, he turned on the bedside lamp. Under the dim yellow light, my embarrassment had nowhere to hide. He slightly lowered his eyes and wiped away the tears at the corners of my eyes with his fingertip. In the long silence where he couldn't give a promise, I opened my mouth firmly and calmly. Arthur, we should have ended long ago. We've reached a dead end. Please be kind and let me go. As early as 2 years ago, our relationship had almost fallen apart. I don't know who was reluctant to part, and we wasted a lot of time in vain. His shadow swayed in the halo. After a while, he said dryly, Lily, you're so smart. You should know that leaving me is not a good choice. I looked into his cold and lonely eyes and questioned his heart. So, do you want me to abandon everything and live in the shadows for the rest of my life? Over the years, I was like a lonely traveler walking in the doomsday. I would always recall those past events slowly in the dead of night to confirm whether he had ever had love for me. At the most ambiguous moments, I would send a tentative good night and wake up 4 times a night to check my phone. Even my consciousness was in a terrible haze. I could even dream that he seemed to have replied to my message. Then this consciousness would drag me out of the dream to check my phone, only to find that apart from my good night, there was no reply. On New Year's Eve, I waited until midnight, calculated his free time, and nervously dialed his phone number. When he answered, I avoided others, squatted on the balcony, and said softly, Arthur. A light laugh came through the phone, carrying an inexplicable vibration. Lily? That was the 3rd month when I was by his side. There were too many people coming and going around him. If I hadn't seen him for a while, he would forget about me. As the firecrackers for welcoming the new year were set off one after another, I didn't have time to think too much and said firmly and passionately, Happy New Year, Arthur. He seemed to sigh. No one knew what he was thinking at that moment. I only heard him say, Lily, may you be healthy in the new year. Let me know when you return to Beijing, and I'll pick you up. They said that Arthur had always been generous to his female companions. When I was still a student who needed to calculate my tuition fee several times, he offered 2 houses in the best area of Xiqing district at once and said I could choose whichever I liked. When he was in the mood, he would casually bid for jewelry at auctions and give them to me. And I, in my shabby dormitory, held the useless jewelry that was delivered to my door as if falling into an absurd comedy. Hearing that a friend gave his female companion a pink car, he had someone change a Lamborghini into pink and took me to see it. I shook my head repeatedly and asked curiously, Arthur, what do you take me for? He was bored, propping up his forehead with one hand and playing with the ends of my hair with the other hand. Does it matter? I just looked at him. Seeing his eyes slightly lowered at the corners, my heart was filled with sourness. I smiled and said, These are not what I want. He stopped smiling. Perhaps because this affection was too heavy, even a playboy like Arthur was a bit afraid. His slightly cold fingers slowly rubbed my earlobe. After a long while, he smiled and said, What a silly girl, from which family? In love, I was never smart. I was single-minded and stubborn, and I just accepted being called silly by him. Back then, after people knew that I was with Arthur, Justin made a huge fuss. But nobody knew what he was fussing about. Only Arthur, with a meaningful look in his eyes, looked at him with a half-smile and pointed at me, saying, She's right there. If you've got the guts, just take her away. When I heard these words, I turned my head to the side and looked up at him, seeing his casualness and his confidence as if victory was already in his hands. At that time, I had almost given half of my heart to him. Hearing those words, I felt half helpless and half unwilling to believe in fate, unwilling to believe that my bond with him was so shallow. So, when Justin pretended to snatch me away and asked me angrily if I wanted to go with him to the next event, I looked at Arthur and gave a bright smile, saying, "Sure." In an instant, the noisy and bustling scene froze. The gazes of all the men and women, those of inquiry, surprise, and doubt, all lingered on me. Justin looked at me as if he had seen a ghost, his eyes wide open. And Arthur pursed his lips a little and then smiled again. He held a card in his hand but didn't play it, just twirling it around. He didn't move, and the others just waited. After a while, he casually threw the card onto the table, messing up the whole gambling game on the table, and looked at me with great interest, saying, "All right, have fun." Just like that, Justin and I walked out of the Quadrangle Club in Hohai on a late autumn night. In the autumn wind, we squatted on the ground side by side like two penguins, not far from that place. One of us didn't dare to leave, and the other didn't want to leave. We could only endure the cold wind, looking rather desolate. He took the opportunity to say, "Lily, every single one of my brother's group is no good. Don't get yourself involved. It's not worth it." I turned my head and smiled, asking, "Are you a good person then?" He thought for a moment and replied frankly, "For now, I am." Indeed, his parents were strict with him. On weekdays, he attended classes honestly. His biggest pastimes were going to KTVs and racing with friends. He didn't cause trouble or do whatever he wanted, which was quite rare. He stamped his feet and said, "To put it bluntly, if you follow him, there won't be a good outcome." "How do you know?" I thought for a while. My mind was a bit slow due to the cold wind. "That there won't be?" "A bit stubborn and a bit willful, probably because of my youth." He sighed, hesitated to speak, and finally just said, "You don't understand." It wasn't until a long time later that I understood the unspoken words in his hesitation. The next second, a black car made a turn and stopped in front of us. Arthur was sitting in the driver's seat. He rolled down the window, twitched the corner of his mouth, and looked at us indifferently. Justin didn't dare to breathe loudly and just pushed me forward, wanting me to bear the anger. Seeing us like this, Arthur, who walked up to us, mocked unceremoniously, "What a pair of poor little lovebirds. Why don't you keep running away?" I threw myself into his arms. My cheek was against his warm chest, and I heard him say in my ear, "You little heartless thing." I looked up at him, with a glistening look in my eyes, as if there were countless beautiful landscapes in them. I wonder if he knew that from the moment he decided to chase after me, some things were destined to no longer be dispensable. In the yard at night, there was a lantern hanging there, swaying in the gentle breeze, just like my heart at that time. Looking back on that time, I completely ignored the consequences, always thinking that love could fill all the gaps. I was extremely naive. In the following years, I met all kinds of people with him. But what I watched the most was still him. The calmness and composure accumulated through the struggles of several generations were vividly reflected in him. When meeting those with a bit more prominent backgrounds, he would introduce them to me in detail beside my EAR.I. In the end, he would pat my shoulder and ask me to hand out a business card. At this time, he was humble, and it was all for me. However, his humility and kindness were still somewhat impersonal. Even when looking at others equally, it seemed like an inborn, top-down act of charity. I once asked him what he was doing this for, and he just smiled and said, "One day, you'll find all of these useful." He, who was so tired of socializing at banquets, could also plan everything for you carefully when he cared about you, determined to make you fall for him completely. One year when he was free, he suddenly had the idea of teaching me archery. In order to win, I practiced it privately every day. One day, I called him over, hit the target with one shot right in front of him, and then turned around with the bow in my hand, looking back. At that time, I curled up the corners of my mouth and looked at him as if asking for credit. He leaned against the door, looked at me for a long time, then walked over in a few steps, threw away the bow in my hand, and then a passionate kiss came, with his lips and tongue invading like a storm. Later, on an endless snowy night, with a hazy drunkenness, he woke me up from my dream and said willfully, "Lily, come downstairs." I was like Cinderella sneaking out at midnight, tiptoeing to rush towards a beautiful dream. The car drove on the highway and went beyond the 6th Ring Road to a private holiday villa. When the driver parked the car at the foot of the mountain, Arthur woke up. He carried me out, lifted me up with both hands, and placed me on the roof of the car. I was so startled that I held his shoulders with both hands. Looking down, I saw his smiling eyes. In the next moment, a magnificent firework display burst out behind me. I turned my head to look. All the stars in the sky seemed tired, blinking their eyes and hiding in the colorful Milky Way, flowing together. I clutched my wildly beating heart and asked blankly, "What's the occasion today?" He caught me and pinched my cheek, saying, "Happy birthday." In the first year, I just found out that my birthday was on the same day as his aunt's. And his family would always gather together to celebrate his aunt's birthday on that day. He would always only come back to me after midnight. It was the same this year, but the only difference was that this year, on the snowy night, there were passionate kisses, warm hugs, and fireworks that belonged only to me. In the year I graduated, I received several job offers, and each of them was an excellent choice among many. However, at the crossroads of my life, I resolutely chose another path. Several like-minded people with the experience and skills we had gained during college just started our own business with a burst of courage. In the dilapidated buildings in Zhongguancun on the 27th floor, countless BPO, migrant workers in Beijing who are striving for success, lived, all dreaming of making a name for themselves. When Arthur knew about my plan, he didn't say anything, but some people were extremely puzzled and thought that I was sacrificing the greater for the lesser. I also told him the theory of picking up sesame seeds while losing watermelons. He smiled casually and said, "Both the sesame seeds and watermelons are yours, Lily. Don't listen to those nonsense." When the company was just starting up, there were fewer than 10 people. I took on almost all the tasks by myself. Programming codes, marketing, promotion and marketing, attracting investments. I did what I knew how to do, and I learned from scratch what I didn't know. At that time, I almost lived in that dilapidated building. Once, the elevator in the building was under maintenance. Arthur made over a dozen phone calls, but nobody answered. Afraid that something might happen to me that night, he climbed up to the 27th floor on foot and walked up to me. The coldness on his fingertips woke me up, who was sleeping among piles of materials. In the darkness, he sighed softly, "You're working so hard like this. Those who don't know might think that I've mistreated you since you've been with me." I muddledly snuggled into his arms. The tip of my nose was filled with the fragrance of wood on him, and in my ear was his slightly panting heartbeat. He probably would never know what these efforts that seemed insignificant to him were for. And at that time, I just thought that whether it was liking Arthur or starting a company, all the things I did were like flying towards the sun. Even if I failed in the end, I would still fall among the clouds. There was a movie called King of Comedy more than 10 years ago. It was rescreened in Beijing in 2014. I vaguely remembered that it was already after midnight at that time, and only tickets for this movie were available. At that time, I heard that his family had given him an ultimatum, asking him to put away his playful heart outside and go back to the right path. So at that time, while he was busy disbanding his own team, he also had to gradually get familiar with the affairs of the family business. He was used to being lazy in private affairs, and those days' affairs took up a lot of his energy. But he still accompanied me to sit in the last row of the cinema. However, just a few minutes after the movie started, he fell asleep out of boredom. At that time, the line, "I'll support you," once surpassed "I love you," and became a synonym for romance. When I accompanied investors to drink without telling him and fell asleep on the sofa with makeup on after getting drunk, when I opened my eyes, I saw him sitting cross-legged on the ground, clumsily removing my makeup with tools in his hand. A small company has made you like this. Even if you just stay at home and play with birds, are you afraid that I can't support you? "I'll support you, Lily," he said. Later, I thought about asking him many times, but I never did. What if I really believed in the promise you casually made? Over the years, when the reality that we had deliberately ignored was put in front of us, it was at a banquet that could be called a family banquet. He took me to the full moon banquet for a relative's child. Over the years, I had only been hovering around him and had never stepped into the real circle he was in. That was originally not an occasion where I should appear. There, I met his mother, who was wearing a custom-made deep purple cheongsam with dark peony embroidery, looking elegant and graceful. I was so nervous that I dug my fingers into my palms. I had rehearsed countless times in my mind how to greet her appropriately. Her eyes didn't stay on me at all. It was a kind of indifference that showed she didn't care at all, a kind of deeply ingrained habit. She just passed by Arthur and said faintly, "Your Uncle Tang is still here. It's okay to have some fun privately, but don't go too far." Arthur put away his smile and quietly blocked my figure. At that moment, all my inferiority and embarrassment seemed to be put under the spotlight, with nowhere to hide. All the details that had been ignored in the past, those pieces of evidence that showed his shallow love, came flooding back one by one. At my graduation ceremony where I almost ran into my mother, he deliberately avoided it. When I asked him drunkenly if he liked me, and he just smiled and couldn't give an answer from beginning to end, I sat in the passenger seat and said, "Are you doing it on purpose? If you want me to recognize my place, you don't have to use this way. As long as you, Arthur, say no, I'll leave immediately." What I said hurt both of us, just like using a knife to cut both of our hearts into pieces until they were bloody and indistinct. He held the steering wheel tightly, with the veins on his hands bulging. He nodded and said, "Do you think what I did tonight was to make you leave sensibly? Do I need to go around like this and make myself look cheap?" When the car passed by Tiananmen Square, the tears that I had been holding back for a long time fell down one by one. Finally, I said the reality that I had never wanted to admit, "I'm wrong. We're not suitable at all. We were wrong from the very beginning." He couldn't figure out why in just half a night, my courage of these past few years could be instantly crushed. That night, the car stayed in the garage for a long time. He unbuckled his seat belt, hugged me tightly in his arms, put his chin on my shoulder, and I could still smell the warmth in his breath when he moved. "Lily," he said, "let me think about it." At that moment, I gave up struggling and didn't even pray for our love to last forever. In the following 2 years, it seemed that we were going to exhaust all the love we had in this lifetime. We quarreled and got entangled. We couldn't make a final decision but were reluctant to let go. When he was in love, he also learned to put aside his pride and coax me. What a coincidence. "My surname is the same as your name. We should be a couple." But I just looked at him calmly and replied after a long while, "Your surname isn't Lee." The corners of his mouth that had been curved slowly flattened, and he couldn't say another word. I had tried to find out about the surname behind Arthur in the dark night, but I got nothing. His information was tightly protected. He was a person who wouldn't make promises, but later, he would give promises from time to time. When we took a walk by the river at night, we happened to come across a man proposing to a woman. He put his arm around my shoulders, half sober and half drunk in his eyes, and pointed at the ring on their hands. "I'll also buy one for our Lily." I looked back at him, seeing his struggle and pain, and said softly, "Arthur, I'll take it seriously. I'll take every word you say seriously, so please don't make promises easily." The drunkenness in his eyes completely disappeared. He just looked at the ordinary yet unattainable happiness in this mortal world across the crowd. In confusion and nonchalance, neither of us admitted that we were bidding farewell to each other at every moment. The news that I had a showdown with Arthur spread quickly in the circle. Jenny rushed into my office early in the morning. She is now the head of the marketing department of Yunchuang and still has a hot-tempered personality. "What does that bastard Arthur mean?" She slapped the table and said angrily, "He's getting married, yet he still wants to hold you back. What on earth does he want to do?" I remembered that last night he didn't respond for a long time after hearing what I said. But after I fell asleep, he sat by the head of the bed until dawn. "Jenny," before I could reply, Justin walked in from outside with his hands in his pockets. "If I hear you scolding my brother again, believe it or not, I'll..." "What? Beat me up? You guys are all bastards." Jenny snorted. Actually, she used to be very afraid of Arthur, but gradually she dared to scold him later. Sometimes Arthur could also hear her scolding, but he rarely got angry and didn't care about it. Justin was too lazy to argue with her and opened his arms towards me casually. "Well, Lily, after you dump my brother, do you want to come into my arms?" I looked at him, smiled, and suddenly asked, "Do you think you're a good person now?" He twitched the corners of his mouth and shrugged his shoulders. I admit defeat. Over the years, there have been countless women around him just for fun. Sometimes I just remembered a name, and then I never saw that person again. Today it's a female college student, tomorrow it's a model or an actress. Besides, he has a good appearance and has even driven some women to attempt suicide because of him. I told Jenny about the affairs of the Hong Kong branch and then rushed to the next place. I needed to settle everything in Beijing and also had to meet Sean. He was not only an angel investor of Yunchuang in the past but also the second largest shareholder. The meeting place was in a private tea house. The man in front of me took my documents but didn't open them. I knew he had something to say. In the next second, he said calmly, "Lily, one shouldn't be too ungrateful." "What?" I was a bit confused and asked subconsciously. "You're capable, educated, and smart." Sean nodded at the window with his chin, speaking casually, "But in Beijing, there are too many people like you. Throw a stone here, and if you hit 3 people, 2 of them will be top students. When you graduated, there were at least 800 business plans placed in front of Huayu Capital. Was yours the best? Not necessarily. However, Huayu invested in it." I pursed my lips and replied, "But the fact has proved that your investment decision was right." Sean was Arthur's friend. When I started this company, he didn't pay much attention to it at first. It was just that once he suddenly mentioned that he had a friend who was interested in this project and then introduced him to me. But after meeting Sean, I realized that he was very strict with the project requirements. Yunchuang was able to get the investment from Huayu after going through many difficulties. Sean shook his head. Getting the investment was just the first step. For startup companies, malicious competition, acquisitions, and suppressions can make your company fail at every step. Have you ever thought about why those people who are out of your reach are willing to listen to your grand plans? Why did Zhonghuan Group cooperate with a small data company 3 years ago? Lily, I believe that you can also make Yunchuang reach this position by yourself, but the price you need to pay is far more than this. Hearing Sean's words, I just realized that the things Arthur didn't care about were all remembered by his friends one by one. Sean was a shrewd businessman. When he started to calculate, he was tougher than anyone else. However, it was really hard to figure out why he said these words at this moment. If it were me a few years ago, I would probably blush with anger and jump up. But now, I'm calmer than anyone else and just asked, Are you asking me to stay by Arthur's side by saying these? He crossed his hands and didn't say yes or no, isn't it right? His marriage should have been settled a year ago. You should know why it has been postponed until now. I almost couldn't believe it and laughed. Do you want me to stay by his side as his mistress? He smiled gently, but his tone was a bit cruel. You've been in this circle for so many years. Haven't you got used to this kind of thing yet? It's not a bad thing for you. I twitched the corners of my mouth. No matter how complicated my relationship with Arthur was, in the eyes of his friends, I was only worthy of this position from the beginning to the end. So, I thought for a while. Since the relationship had already broken down, I didn't need to worry about anything anymore, so I asked indifferently, do you have the same idea about Ruan Chu? After you get married to someone else, you'll force her to continue to be your mistress who can't see the light, right? How can you be so confident that she'll be willing? Do you think she'll leave you if she knows your thoughts? I had only seen the girl beside Sean twice. She was amazingly beautiful but extremely gentle. Hearing this, the corners of Sean's mouth curved slightly. There was displeasure in his eyes, but he was very certain, she won't. He seemed to remember something and said in a stiff tone, she's different from you. She can only stay by my side. I didn't want to argue with him anymore. I stood up, tapped on the documents on the table, repeated my requests, and left without looking back. After I left, Sean's phone that was placed upside down on the table rang. He picked it up. The man on the other end of the phone sounded tired. Let her do whatever she wants. Don't make things difficult for her. Sean snorted through his nose, Arthur, you're really useless. You can't even handle a woman. The other end was silent. Sean continued, since you knew from the beginning that you couldn't give her a proper status, you shouldn't have raised a canary into an eagle. Once its wings grow strong, you won't be able to keep it even if you want to. Arthur suddenly asked him, have you ever raised flowers? Sean didn't answer, knowing that there was something implied in his words. In the next second, he heard a distant voice on the other end of the phone, it won't feel good to watch the flower you've carefully raised wither away beside you. Sean, who hung up the phone, crossed his legs and looked at the floating clouds outside the window. He sneered at Arthur's words in his heart. No matter whether it was a flower or a bird, as long as it belonged to him, Sean, it could only die by his side. The meeting with Sean ended on bad terms. I drove back to the villa in Shishan. The empty villa was pitch dark. It seemed that he hadn't been back here for a long time. I unconsciously let out a sigh of relief. In our current situation, once we met, we would completely ruin the affection we had in the past. This place once witnessed almost all the passionate times between Arthur and me. It was the first time I had come back here since I moved out 2 years ago. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor and found a blue velvet box in the small drawer of the master bedroom. There were 2 plain rings, one big and one small, lying inside. I had forgotten it here for too long. Now it was useless and shouldn't stay here anymore. When I walked out of the master bedroom, I accidentally glanced and saw that the door of the guest bedroom on the 2nd floor was open. The guest bedroom that no one had ever set foot in before was covered with a light blue velvet bedding set, and a set of young ladies' pajamas was scattered on the sofa. When Arthur bought this villa, it was empty. I had put a lot of thought into decorating every flower, every grass, every wall, and every chair here. Only this room was like a crack that had split open. Although it had nothing to do with me, it made me unable to move a step. I closed my eyes, endured the sourness in my nose, and walked out quickly. In the dim yellow light, I didn't look back again. Just like throwing away all the love and hate, the villa behind me was getting farther and farther away from me. When the car passed through Dongzaimen, the mobile phone placed on the center console lit up. The next second after seeing the message, I pulled over and stopped the car urgently. It was from the private doctor I had reserved. Miss Lily, the test results are out. You are currently 9 weeks and 2 days pregnant. You can come over for a detailed examination when you have time. There was an attached examination report sheet below. I lowered my head, held my phone in my hands, and enlarged the picture with 2 fingers again and again. It was just a small blob and couldn't be seen clearly. Looking at it, I put the back of my hand to my lips and bit it until my whole body was trembling. I tried not to cry out, but I couldn't control the big tears falling one by one onto the screen. I had once looked forward to having a child related by blood with Arthur. But at that time, he just rubbed my fingers and asked slowly, isn't it okay like this, Lily? Later, when he couldn't control his emotions, I would calmly remind him, I don't want to take medicine. You should take precautions. It'll be troublesome if I get pregnant. He gasped lowly beside my ear, recklessly, then give birth to it. This child came at an inappropriate time and wasn't expected. Looking at the time, it was probably from that fierce quarrel 2 months ago. During that excessive quarrel, neither of us would admit defeat. Knowing that we shouldn't do it, it seemed that he only had that way left to prove that we still belonged to each other. When I returned to the house in the urban area, the huge living room was pitch dark until I pressed the switch. Then I saw Arthur sitting on the sofa. He hunched his shoulders, sank slightly into the backrest, and hung his head, playing with the lighter in his hand. I leaned against the entrance, and our eyes met when he looked up. For a moment, there was nothing to say, and silence spread. Before he could speak, I sat beside him, put my head on his chest, and curled up in his arms like a baby. I said slowly, "Arthur, I have a stomachache. Rub it for me." After quarreling for so long, this was the first time that I showed weakness to him again. A look of surprise flashed in his eyes. He held me up a little higher, put his chin on my shoulder, pulled my clothes, and then put a warm palm on my stomach and gently rubbed it in circles. "Arthur, touch it and say goodbye to it." I closed my eyes, clenched fingers, and my tears wet his chest. "Does it hurt so much?" He lifted my face, with a solemn expression. "I'll take you to the hospital." "No, it's much better. It doesn't hurt anymore." I got up from him and smiled gently. That night, there was no earth-shattering quarrel or a fight to the death. Throughout the whole night, he held me in his arms and rubbed my stomach from time to time. This place once witnessed almost all the passionate times between Arthur and me. It was the first time I had come back here since I moved out 2 years ago. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor and found a blue velvet box in the small drawer of the master bedroom. There were 2 plain rings, one big and one small, lying inside. There were debris everywhere, but we had no heart to enjoy the view. It snowed again in Beijing. The snow had piled up thick in recent days. Before going to the hospital, I sat alone for a long time. Again and again, I felt that faint vitality with my hands. That day was a rare sunny day, and it was always good to be a bit warmer. The operation was carried out quickly and took about 20 minutes. While I was still under the influence of anesthesia and hadn't woken up yet, vaguely, someone gently put their hand on my stomach and sighed, "What a pity." This was the second time I saw her, and probably the last time too. She was Arthur's mother. "Have a sip of hot soup." She pushed the bowl of soup with her hand. It was a bowl of pigeon soup. I couldn't figure out how she got the news and managed to prepare the soup within such a short time. I pushed the bowl of soup away and said calmly, "Don't worry. I won't make an issue of this." Her jet black and beautiful hair was tied low into a bun, and the emerald on her neck was low-key yet luxurious. "You're more ruthless than I thought. I originally thought you would secretly give birth to the child. After all, over the years, I've seen too many girls like you." "Madam," I didn't know how to address her. Even if I hadn't taken the initiative to get rid of the child, your visit this time would have made me abort it anyway. She took a glance at the bowl of soup, and I followed her gaze. She never bothered and would never deign to tell me that this bowl of soup wasn't made by the chef in a restaurant outside but was cooked by her, who had never stepped into the kitchen before. Whether it was to make up for something, out of guilt, or for other reasons, no one knew. She said faintly, "Arthur is getting married soon. He can have illegitimate children, but at least not before marriage. If you like, I won't object to you two staying together. If you have children in the future, I won't stand in the way either. I can take the child over and give him the best. Don't worry." I raised my head, straightened my back, and interrupted her, "There won't be a future. There will never be a future. Between him and me, since it started clearly, it will end clearly. In this world, not everyone who gets close to you is greedy for power and status. And not everyone has to bow and scrape without dignity just to step into that circle." She smiled and shook her head. "I thought you loved Arthur deeply. I didn't expect it was just like this." Her gaze was downward looking, as if she was on a high mountain, looking down at ants. More than 100 years ago, in that turbulent era, the people from her mother's family went abroad to study at Ivy League schools. As for my family, it took nearly 100 years of hard work just to reach where I am now. I stood up, picked up my bag with my still weak fingers, and said, "I do love him, but I can't love him to the point of losing my dignity and myself." After thinking for a while, I spoke again, "About the child." She lowered her head and gently stirred the spoon in the soup. "I've already had people block the news. As long as you don't tell anyone, he will never know about it in his lifetime. Of course, Miss Lily is a smart person. Some things are better kept to yourself." I turned around and walked out. My steps were weak. No matter how bright the winter sun was, it still couldn't drive away the chill all over my body. Since I had the operation by myself, I had made up my mind not to let him know. Once, for the sake of loving him, I dared to charge through thousands of troops and horses. But now, I didn't have the strength anymore. A black car entered Yuchuan Mountain from the west gate of the Summer Palace and stopped at the foot of the mountain. Arthur knocked on the door of the small villa where his grandfather was recuperating. The person who opened the door was his mother. Grace looked at the snow on his shoulders and reached out to pat it off. She knew why he had come, so she didn't say anything and just watched him go upstairs. After half an hour, Arthur came out of the upstairs room. He put one hand on the railing of the corridor, leaned against the railing with his back, and stood there with his head lowered for a long time. Grace knew that what her son wanted to ask for couldn't be obtained again. She looked at Arthur. "Your grandfather has already agreed to the marriage with the Tang family." Deal with those troubles outside and then settle down. Arthur turned around and stopped, looking at his mother who had always been cold and indifferent, and suddenly asked, Mom, have you been happy all these years after marrying someone you don't love? For the first time, a stunned expression appeared on the face of the well-maintained noblewoman. She frowned. Arthur, are you now daring to turn your gun on your mother just for an outsider? All these years, you haven't liked me either. Arthur continued, as a child born from an arranged marriage, I can't please you no matter what I do. Grace had a lover when she was young. He was a college student from the countryside and later became a physics professor at a university in Beijing. She was forced by her family to marry Arthur's father and broke up with that young professor. If it had ended like this, it might not have been a big deal. But in the second year after Grace got married, that professor died of depression at the young age of 28. The boldest and most unconventional thing Grace did in her life was that after his death, she took care of his old mother regardless of what others thought and saw her off when she passed away. And Arthur's father, as a child from a wealthy family, had always been arrogant. Even though he had some feelings for Grace, as time passed, those feelings had long disappeared. As a result, his father didn't come home even once a year now, and Grace didn't care. Even if he kept a mistress, she didn't care. Because she didn't care about his father, Grace had always been strict and cold towards Arthur. Arthur raised his head slightly to hold back the tears in his eyes. Mom, you know? Once I let go, she will never come back to me in her lifetime. I've been your son for over 20 years. Have you ever considered me even a little bit? She had played an important role in facilitating the marriage with the Tang family and was more than happy to see it happen. Grace tightened the shawl around her body and didn't dare to look into his eyes. She just said, you should understand the current situation. Arthur said firmly, we can still live a stable life without the Tang family. She quickly replied, you know your grandfather's health. Do you want him to leave with regrets? Grace was in a daze. Such words had been pressed on her by her father back then, and now she was pressing them on her own son. Arthur sneered and turned around to leave quickly. Behind him, Grace watched him walking away gradually and subconsciously called out, Arthur. Arthur, Mom has walked this path before, and you can too. After the contract for the project between Yunchuang and Bank of China was signed, it meant that my work in Beijing had come to an end for the time being. The preparation for the Hong Kong branch company had also reached the final stage, and the new projects there had already started to be negotiated. It was precisely the time when people were needed. Before leaving Beijing, I handed the house I bought 2 years ago to an agent and asked him to help list it for rent. While I was packing my things, Arthur sat beside me. His eyes stayed on me and followed me from time to time. He grabbed my hand and slowly put forward an unreasonable request, Lily, stay in Beijing for a few more days. They need people there. I have to rush over, I said softly. After thinking for a while, I added, treat your wife well after you get married. It was already past midnight. The antique pendulum clock struck midnight, urging the end of this drama. The parting came unusually calmly. Perhaps it was because we had both tried our best, so we could accept the impossibility calmly. Just like fireworks are gorgeous when they bloom but often disappear silently when they fade away. I pushed my suitcase to the entrance hall. Arthur watched silently, and his gaze burned like fire behind me. If he had forced me to stay, I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to resist at all. But he just called my name softly, Lily. I turned around to look at him. His face was as white as jade, and the cold and icy eyes slowly melted into a faint smile. He reached out his hand towards me, come here and let me give you a hug. I blinked my eyes and walked towards him willfully, just like the first time I ran towards him. It was the last time I ran towards him. His powerful arms seemed to crush me. He asked, over the years, have you regretted meeting me? I hugged his waist and abdomen, felt the warmth of our bodies touching for the last time, and shed my last tears for him. No, I don't regret it. Even if I fell into the endless darkness and was trapped in the Avicii hell forever, Arthur, I never regretted meeting you. He didn't let me look up but just held me tightly. His words were slow, one by one, no matter how busy you are with work, remember to have meals. Okay. Remember to have your stomach checked regularly. Okay. If someone bullies you, tell me, and I'll stand up for you. This time, there was no response for a long time. After a long while, he turned me around so that I couldn't see his eyes and he couldn't see mine either. I won't see you off on the day you leave for Hong Kong. I didn't look back and just said, take care of yourself. He was tied by too many strings, and the one that connected him to me was the easiest to cut off. I had nothing to complain about. Arthur, your complicated life is too long and too broad. It's enough that I once had a moment with you. On the day Lily's plane left for Hong Kong, Jenny and Justin went to see her off. In the airport VIP lounge, the man in a black long coat sat quietly until the plane took off. He looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows. After the huge plane taxied, it slowly rose into the sky until it couldn't be seen anymore. The plane disappeared into the sky at an altitude of 20,000 feet, taking his lover and almost all of his love in this lifetime far away to another place. The end.